Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast. My name is Duncan Cook, founder of Three-Sided Cube, trusted technology partner for some world-changing organizations. We know the power that technology has to have a positive impact on people's lives. But on this podcast, myself and my co-hosts Puff and Sophie are out to meet the people behind the technology, hear their stories and understand what drives them, and hopefully inspire others to join the mission and do some good in the world.
Hi everyone, this is another episode of Igniting Change, and I have got Elizabeth Shaughnessy with me today, and I'm sorry if that is nice. I just realised that probably.
No, that was right. That was great.
Amazing, nailed it. So Elizabeth is the digital programs lead at Oxfam, and we're going to talk a bit about her background. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. So you are currently the digital programs lead at Oxfam. So we will talk a little bit more about the organisation and the role of technology in that in a little bit. Can you tell us a bit about, so your background? You have very impressive and extensive education. I did a LinkedIn stalk and was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. So you did your degree in English, is that right? And that was in Santa Barbara?
Yes, yeah, University of California, Santa Barbara, which is a mouthful.
yeah, not a snappy one. And that was amazing. So you went out there and presumably went for the sunshine to enjoy some of that.
Well, I'm from California originally. Oh. Yeah, so it was about a 4-hour drive from my hometown.
Oh, right, okay, fine.
Yeah.
So you're used to the sunshine, okay. Oh, so you must have had a bit of a shock when you went to Oxford then. That must have been
I'm chasing the good weather, just going from California to Boston to London.
That's fair. Yeah, so then you did computer science after that, so...
Briefly, yeah, I did sort of a foundational course while I was working for a technology company back in Boston because I didn't have that foundation in computer science before getting into technology, and so I wanted to just understand how it all worked, and it was like a super intensive deep dive into computer science. It was very intensive, but it was a lot of fun and ended up with some pretty good foundational knowledge about technology and the internet and how it all works, which is great.
Yeah, nice. That's very diligent, because I think for a lot of us when we came into the technology, when I first came into it, I had no idea. It was like the episode of the IT Crowd where they sort of try and explain the internet to her, and she's just like, what is happening?
Yeah, packets. It's all packets.
Yeah, it's fine. But yeah, that's impressive to kind of come into the industry and be like, all right, I want to know more about this, and then go and do that foundation. That must have been a hell of a learning curve, but
It was, definitely. Yeah.
But it must have helped so much to have that like proper understanding of it, so he doesn't feel like... Yeah,
it was a 3-month program, so it was by no means like a university degree or anything like that. But it was, I think, part of the name was definitely intensive. So I think just being able to cover like the origin of computer science and really learning the mechanics of how everything worked. And then we actually learned C, like C, not C++, but C, like the old programming language, which I have not used ever since, but it's sort of like learning Latin, I think, because then I used that to learn JavaScript, PHP, which I cannot write now, but it's like any language, I guess.
Yeah, you've got to keep using it. 100%. But I think it's really great if you're working in this sector, and particularly if you're working directly with developers. Apart from anything else, it's the empathy factor. Just being able to kind of understand that what people are doing is really complicated, and it is really difficult, and it can, understanding the limitations to an extent, I think is really helpful. When I started learning JavaScript very briefly, and then kind of realised I was far too old and too tired to learn the language. I had a small child at the time, so it just wasn't particularly compatible, and I was always terrible at languages. But it gave me a real understanding and kind of like empathy with the developers of being like, what you are doing is incredible, and just a general understanding of how things fit together. So I think that's very impressive. And then from there, you did your master's in global government and diplomacy. So that is incredible. So was that, as a result, that kind of humanitarian steer, was that as a result of the company that you were working for, or was it something you were always interested in?
So I I was actually listening to another one of your recent episodes, and I heard someone describe their career path as circuitous, and I thought, oh, that's such a good word for this, because I feel like, I started with an English literature background. Like, I specialized in medieval texts, like translating Old English texts, which was a lot of fun, but not at all what I'm doing now. And like needed to kind of, when I started working in technology, needed to be able to communicate with anyone in the engineering department, plus also anyone in client management services, because we were sort of the interface between the two teams in my role at the time. And then from there, from the jobs that I worked in tech in Boston for like 2 to 3 years, I just realized that there was something absent from my life, some purpose that was missing from my career. And the career itself was good, the job was good, the company was great, enjoyed all of my working with my coworkers and all of that, but it wasn't a purpose-driven kind of career or life that I was leading. And so, but I didn't have any background in humanitarian development. I was really interested in it. I had, obviously some historical knowledge of conflict and crises because of my previous degree going back, of like a millennia or millennium. Sure. But I really wanted to first just test the waters if this was something for me before doing a whole career change, and to see if I could do it, basically. So I actually spent a couple of years. One of those years was doing my master's, but a couple of years volunteering with local organizations in Bosnia. I interned with the Child Protection NGO in Croatia just after my studies. I participated in some research locally in Sarajevo, and just wanted to kind of get an understanding for how civil society operates, and that was just a particular area of interest for me. And so from there, I applied for and then subsequently did my master's in global governance and diplomacy at Oxford, and then from there, made the leap to Oxfam, where I've been for like 6.5 years.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And I think, again, it's so diligent to be like, I think this is a thing that's missing, but I'm going to go into this and kind of do a proper job of doing all the research and stuff. That's absolutely amazing. And presumably that degree, the master's, has that kind of come in helpful in the time, or was it just a good kind of launching platform into humanitarian?
I think it was a good introduction to a lot of the theory behind the humanitarian sector and how development works, peace building, governance, generally speaking. It was actually, this is maybe a technical point that doesn't need explaining, but it was a 2-track degree where you either picked global governance or you picked diplomacy, but regardless, you got the full title. So I only did global governance, and yeah, that was mostly focused on peace building, conflict, pre and post conflict studies, and international development writ large. And so I think that not having the background in that in the first place, not coming from a political science degree or international development or international relations, having that foundation, again, was really helpful just to have a base. But I mean, practically speaking, I think my experience both in the Balkan region and then with Oxfam has been, the most useful, lived experience of this is what it's like working at an NGO. These are the complexities. And I've held many roles at Oxfam, so I've seen a lot of different components to how, NGOs operate and their mechanics.
Yeah, of course. And I was key word there being the theory. I was going to say, I can imagine there's quite a difference between what you learn in the sort of masters versus when you're actually on the ground and how those kind of things play out. And I guess over time as well, kind of the strategies and methods maybe change a bit as time goes on, and the different things to deal with, all the AI stuff, which we will talk about later. But as the world changes, I guess the methods and the governance changes along with it. So it's more of a snapshot as you're doing it, as opposed to kind of, this is how this will always work.
It's always evolving. And I think, and I do still like to kind of keep a tab on what's going on in academia, not the full blown. I don't really have time to read the really long academic papers, and they tend not to be really useful for what I'm doing. But broadly speaking, just the lens with which we're looking at what we're trying to do and the evolution of that over time is really useful. I mean, the sector in my view, has changed dramatically since I was studying it in academia and then was even entering it. And then, the last 5 years, there's been huge changes, but especially in the digital and technological space.
Yeah, of course. Can you talk a bit more about that in terms of the change that you've seen? And
yeah, I think one of the biggest trends that I'm seeing, which I'm really happy about actually, but did not come up at all when I was studying, or it wasn't really, this personally speaking, it might have been existing, but I just wasn't aware of it. But there, in the last few years, especially, there have been calls to decolonize the humanitarian sector and what that really means in practice. And I think for me, that's applied to how we look at how technology can reproduce colonialities of power in the field, in the countries and communities where we're operating. So like that's a big shift in thinking. That's going from essentially looking at technology services as what you would think of ICT for D, like information communication technology for development, or traditional service delivery, is saying like we have these centralized tools, we manage them in a global north NGO, and we are distributing it amongst our country teams to use, as opposed to kind of locally led and operationalized technologies, or using technologies that are actually built by local communities, or having that participatory approach. So like that's one big transformation that I've seen over the last 5 years, and is still developing very much so.
Yeah, of course. And like you say, that sounds like a positive change, but quite a big change. So I can imagine culturally within the organisation.
Yeah, it's both. It's like a theoretical shift, and it's also a mindset shift, but it's also an operational shift of like, how are we actually meant to be delivering digital technologies in a way that is sustainable for the future and that is meaningful and aligned with our values.
Yeah, of course, because they're part of the mission with Oxfam is the lasting change, right? So it's not just you can't just go in and kind of drop a solution that might work for a couple of years and then kind of leave. Not suggesting that's what Oxfam did, but I guess kind of working in this new way is hopefully more sustainable and brings out the more lasting change, because it's sort of systemic change, isn't it?
Exactly,
sort of doing it within the communities. That's great. Okay. So speaking of Oxfam, so you've been there for 6 years and 4 months when I know. So obviously Oxfam is one of the huge organisations that everyone kind of is aware of, but just for the sake of making sure that everyone is clear, can you talk a bit about the organisation and what it does?
Definitely. So I work for Oxfam Great Britain, which is one of many Oxfams around the world. Oxfam is a confederation of global of nonprofits working to end the injustice of poverty. So we do that by looking at all the various things that factor into poverty and inequality. So the work that we actually do looks multifarious. Like there's a lot of different kinds of work that we do. We do both humanitarian response for that, life-saving, immediate term aid that's needed. We also do longer term development. We work in women's rights and gender justice. We work on climate justice. We work on conflict-sensitive areas in humanitarian. So we work on loads of different things, but all of those piece back to these are the levers of change almost. Like these are the things that we need to address in order to get to the root of what is driving poverty and the inequalities that are driving that poverty around the world. Okay,
amazing. And so you've been there for just over 6 years, so you've had a few different roles there. So can you talk about the sort of how you started and what you were doing then? And
Sure, yeah. I actually started on the internal communications team at Oxfam Great Britain. I've been with Oxfam Great Britain the whole time. And I was there for about 3 years, and I worked on, we had a lot of different, we had a lot of reorganizations while I was in that role. So I went from kind of working with finance and IT to operations to a mix of those things. But one of the main things I worked on while I was in that role was actually helping the organization come to terms with GDPR before, during, and after 2018, when it was introduced in the EU and then subsequently in the UK, which there weren't that many changes. So that was pretty straightforward. And so that involved like really heavy communications and engagement strategy, how to communicate what is like a bulky regulation that is also quite technical, and humanize it essentially. And so we took the approach of personal data is a human right. Data protection, data privacy is a human right. So we have the obligation as a human rights organization to protect the data that we hold and that we're responsible for. And that helped kind of land that message across the different departments. And then from there, I went to actually joined the data protection team. So I joined the umbrella information security team, and I worked on data privacy for a little while. And then I moved over to the role I'm in now, which is the digital programs lead.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I really love that, data privacy as a kind of human right. That is a really nice, because normally when you say GDPR, people are like, oh God, it was obviously quite an ordeal. I think anyone that kind of worked on it at the time is sort of almost a bit scarred by it, because it was such a huge change, right? And especially for charities and NGOs, because it was a big thing of how you contact people and potential kind of donor dollars and all the rest of it. So that's a really nice way of kind of framing that, to think about it as a human right. I really like that. Okay, and of course now you are the digital programs lead at Oxfam. So what does that look like? What does that entail?
So I have a team of 3. It's a team of 3. It's a matrix management organization, so explaining the management is a little complicated sometimes. But direct team of 3. We've also got 2 who kind of matrix in, who specialize in humanitarian information communication technology delivery. And then we also have a wider network of digital program staff around the Confederation. I think we're up to 17, 19 now. We've had some recent changes. But within my direct team, the Oxfam Great Britain Digital Programs team, we work on 3 specific areas. So we have sort of the business as usual technology support to country teams and partners. It can look a little bit like traditional ICT4D, but with some distinction that, again, like we're trying to be more about building local capacity and having that sustainable digital maturity. So we call it the digital journey of our country teams. And then we also look at where digital specifically is a lever of change. So where does digital technology intersect with the thematic focus areas that Oxfam focuses on? So, for instance, how does digital intersect with women's rights and gender justice? An obvious example would be the gig economy and care work. So how are we kind of reconciling digital platforms with traditionally informal work done by women? So we're looking at that. And then the third one is what we call rights in a digital age. So that's, again, as a human rights organization, how are we thinking about digital and the online space? Like, we can acknowledge that the world is increasingly online and unequal. So how are we adapting to those changes? And so we have, and this is across the Confederation of Oxfams, and we look at 5 specific pillars for that. So that's going to cover things like access, responsible data, digital security, AI and automation, and governance. I might be missing one, but that's essentially what we cover. We cover all 3 of those areas. So one day we could be working on building like an information management system in one of our countries with the country team in partnership with them and helping partners access some of those digital technology platforms we're using. We also might be supporting research. We are doing these things, supporting research on a topic like my team is working on research into AI and gender, particular gender bias in the Middle East and North Africa region. We at the same time, helping a country team to respond to a government consultation on their new regulation around digital technology. So it's lots of different things, but the idea is to have this holistic approach towards digital technology within our programming across all of our programs.
Wow, so it's nice and varied then. So no 2 days are the same. That's brilliant. That's kind of what you want, isn't it? I was really interested in what you were saying. So the second point, so the digital as a lever of change, you talk about the intersections. And you mentioned something about with the women's rights. Can you talk a bit more, something I'm very passionate about, can you talk a bit more about that, about what you're doing, if you're okay to talk about that today?
Absolutely, yeah. So within Oxfam Great Britain, one of our like work streams is on valuing women's work in particular, and it connects to a broader Confederation-wide theme on women's rights and gender justice. So we have this research project going on within the UK, but with the potential to be more international because we've got various countries who are working on similar themes.
Yeah.
Where we're essentially looking at what, research and knowledge that we have about digital platforms and the gig economy is traditionally looking at roles that are filled by men. So things like, grocery delivery, food delivery, taxis and driving, those are typically or mostly filled by men in those roles, and so subsequently a lot of the research that we have is focused on men's work rather than women in those spaces, and so we're just trying to at the moment fill that gap, fill that knowledge gap, and understand what's actually there. Is there something there? Because we know that there are increasingly platforms for things like care work, domestic labor. I think roles that are traditionally filled by women.
Yeah.
But we don't have the data. So there's some research that came out last year about this. Some really fantastic research by ActionAid, by Fair Work. But we're just trying to help kind of to cover the rest of that and to understand, at least from Oxfam's point of view, how does this intersect with our work? Where can we contribute? Where can we support local partners?
So is that trying to understand why that gap is there and how to kind of leverage that to make the technology available to provide for the gig economy for the women's work?
So it's sort of a two-parter. We don't have a specific agenda for influencing or advocacy yet because we're just sort of feeling it out and seeing what is there. For instance, but there are instances where it could be about how to actually leverage that technology for good. So in Bangladesh in particular, I wasn't part of this, but I'd read about the report and it was fantastic. In Bangladesh, the team there had actually partnered with a tech company I might need to double check fact check this, but
sure.
They had partnered with a local tech company to help build an app specifically for women to be able to enter the gig economy, and it was a big success, and it was really interesting reading about how to actually create that partnership to develop that technology specifically for women so that they could enter this economy. So I think that's really great. But then the flip side of that is also, what are the risks that we're seeing with the gig economy, and how is that going to be affecting women, and how is it already affecting women in otherwise invisible ways? Because we don't have the data on it, or we don't have a full scope of data on it, any of the harms that might be coming from using digital platforms, we might not be seeing. So, for instance, this type of work is typically precarious. It's typically done by migrant women, and so we're just trying to assess like what is the scope of this, of the risks and harms potentially, as well as opportunities for good.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because it's always a double-sided thing, isn't it? There's the opportunity, but the risk as well. I guess particularly for those kinds of jobs that you were talking about earlier in terms of sort of delivering and things like that. And it's the digital, the access that you get to the people in those that are doing those jobs and how you can speak to them and stuff. I guess there is a risk for women that perhaps isn't there for men. Okay,
sorry. I think maybe another really interesting example, if I could just add this one.
Yeah, please do.
Which isn't something that we have like a specific project developed for at the moment, but any work at Oxfam typically involves gender, just because we take a gender transformative approach. Like, we want to always have a gendered lens to any work that we do, so that we are understanding where those invisible ties might be happening. But one really clear case where digital intersects with women's rights and gender justice is around violence, so gender-based violence. So you can obviously have physical violence in the physical world, but that is often, and we are seeing increasing research showing that is often paired with online violence. Okay. They can happen separately. They can happen, independent of each other, but they also can very much happen together. So, for instance, like, you could have domestic violence, gender-based violence in the household, and the replication of that online might be like controlling of mobile phones, controlling of those online spaces, surveillance, things like that. Likewise, you could have violence that originates on the online space that is then reproduced in the physical world. Like something escalates beyond online bullying or trolling or whatever to physical violence against a woman or a girl. So we are definitely seeing that. And so one of the big questions that we're wanting to ask this year is, what can we do with online spaces in a way that ensures safety of women, access to the online space, access to physical technology like mobile technology, to improve participation, to improve safety, to improve data sharing, things like that.
Yeah, because it's definitely, just from obviously not doing any kind of research, but just from being a woman that exists and who spends time in online spaces, there's a bit of a resigned kind of inevitability of you kind of expect in public online spaces it to devolve against women in certain things. So sort of gaming forums, stuff like that in particular, you get women kind of sharing their experiences of being a gamer or being a game designer. Game developer in particular seems to be an intersection that just brings out the very worst in people, sort of female developers, particularly for games. Like I said, there's that thing of you kind of go and the comments and the just the vitriol and the anger and stuff that's in there, it's just horrendous to see. And you do sort of look at it and think, Christ, that's online, but the threat of the violence feels so real that you think, I wouldn't be surprised if that does go into the kind of physical world, like you say. And it is, I think it's really frustrating being a woman in the industry. You sort of look at it and you think, well, no wonder the numbers are so low for women wanting to go into tech and kind of be able to talk about it openly and not have to worry about their safety. I mean, what a ridiculous kind of thing to have to talk about your career and then worry about your physical safety. Just seems completely insane. But the online violence against women just seems, it's kind of, maybe it's my age, but it just seems so inevitable. So it's amazing to hear that that's something that is kind of being looked into. It'd be really interesting, because I think for the next generation, God, I sound old when I talk like this, but for the next generation, there's so much of their life is online. So if that continues in the trend of like women feeling unsafe, then the more time they spend online, the more time they're just going to feel unsafe, and that escalation into the physical world, it seems like a horrible thing. So it'd be good if you guys could sort that out. That would be great. If you could just solve that would be wonderful.
That would be great. I'll report back.
Yeah, if you can just let them know for me, Elizabeth, that would be great. But yeah, it's stuff like that. It's just so interesting, and something that would be great to be able to read along. So if there's anything that you can any reports or anything, please send them our way. That's so interesting, and really great to hear about this sort of gender lens as well, because that's such an important part, and it does play such a big part, particularly again I think in the kind of the technology side of it, because so much of the technology is being built and studied and researched by men. So I think kind of that has an impact in terms of how the technology then impacts what the kind of big NGOs are working on. So it's really good to make sure that there's always that lens on it, I think. And how does you've talked a bit about those kind of examples, but in a wider sense, how does sort of Oxfam benefit from kind of technology in general? Is it kind of a big part of the mission and what they're trying to do? I mean, I'm guessing so.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that this is an evolving area for Oxfam for sure. And it really depends on where you sit in the organization for how it's going to impact you or affect you. So I think the most obvious element is our IT infrastructure, like what tools we have, what tools we use, both hardware and software, what's available and things like that, which is not where I work. I work in digital programs, specifically looking at digital technology within humanitarian and development programs, which is similar but separate. Mm-hmm. And I think the structure that we have within my team is similar to how the Oxfam Confederation is it's the direction of travel. So we have kind of the trying to have a useful toolbox that country teams can access and utilize. So basically removing the barriers of access to digital technology for programmatic purposes, but not necessarily removing like the localization and the contextualization. And then likewise, within our global strategic framework, so our 10-year strategy, digital 3-4 years ago, was identified as being a key area to an emerging theme is what we called it. So, basically, what do we do with digital? We know it's a thing. We know it's impacting us. We know it's related to our cause. But what do we do? And over the last 3-4 years, that rights in a digital age and the digital intersecting with our thematic focus areas, those things have matured. So now that's we've just had sort of a second horizon scan for the rest of the 2030 strategy. And digital is one of those key focus areas now. So it has moved from emerging big question mark to this is absolutely a priority for Oxfam, but more so in the sense of like the digital civic space, the online world. That could be access to democracy, access to having a voice, participating in groups, and likewise digital technology, but more so the use of it and what comes after you use digital technologies. So it's definitely part of the strategy moving forward, which is great. I think related to that, it's not brand new for Oxfam. I mean, I think in 2015 we were one of many organizations who were sort of coming to terms with data responsibility, how to use personal data of program participants in a responsible and ethical way, in a safe way, things like that. And so we do have, a policy on data responsibility in our programs, which has been driving a lot of this since that 2015 time. I can hear myself waffling a little bit, and I think I've actually forgotten the question. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's just around how Oxfam is kind of using technology to have impact, basically. So it sounds like it's just like you say, it's gone from emerging to kind of you can't get away from it, right? It's like this is happening. It's happening. So how do we make use of it?
Yeah.
And the accessibility I think is a really key one because of the sort of the mission of kind of the fighting the inequality for to end poverty and justice. Got it written down. That is a really key one because I think there's such a and obviously you will be able to talk about this with much more authority than I can, but the kind of something that we, in the work that we've done with other NGOs, is that kind of divide in like digital wealth. So just the understanding of how to use technology as well. And, more and more services kind of going online. So, in the UK, sort of government and like benefits and things like that, and being able to get to that. But if you don't have that ability, if you've never been taught how to use it, or you've grown up in a situation where you couldn't afford to use the technology, then that you're being left behind in ways that are not just, you can't get onto TikTok, like, oh no. This is real life sort of changing kind of negative and could leave you in a really bad situation. So I think it's a really important one, that sort of digital wealth divide. So it sounds like that's kind of on the agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, apologies because someone's now at my door.
This is what the edit's for. You're fine. No, you can, if you need to go and do something.
No, my partner's got it, but just in case you hear it on the microphone. So yes, the digital divide I think is a really interesting point because there's sort of the broad digital divide of like, digital maturity. I really don't love the term digital maturity, but it's what we're working with. So with digital literacy, like how well you can adopt and use and integrate technology into your life, how quickly you can do it, how affordable it is, whether you have access to the internet in a reliable, continuous way, things like that. So that's sort of everyone is affected by that. But then when you start adding, again, like those intersectional lenses to it, you get even deeper and wider divides, which, is something that at Oxfam, where we think about systems change, we think about power structures, we think about these intersecting elements. That's really important in how we then program, whether create programs like project work, actually working with communities, or advocacy and influencing. So, I'm sure you're well aware of like the gender digital divide, that's the gender element to it. So that is that whole digital divide, but looking at it from the perspective of the additional burdens or challenges that women and girls face. I think that comes into play definitely in the context where we work within global NGOs, because one of the examples that I have personally found interesting and really telling is, we can talk about gender digital divides, but then if we're working with a community where we know, okay, this is the internet penetration rate, this is what we know that the community has access to, these are the number of mobile phones that we know that they definitely have, like they're they're digitally literate in that sense. But then when you get into the nitty gritty of it and you see, okay, well, there's one mobile phone per household. Well, what does that mean in practice? It most likely means that, the man, the husband, the father, whoever is most likely using that phone the most. Whether that's, again, for access to the economy, because they're out and about more, whatever the case is, that introduces a new element to the broader digital divide, which needs addressing if we're going to really meaningfully affect change.
Yeah, because the systems change that you talk about, so big fan of systems thinking, love it. But that, I think, when you kind of zoom out and you're sort of looking at how things are changing, and then you introduce one change and then it kind of has that knock-on effect, and today's solutions are tomorrow's problems. But I think, when you talk about the gender divide earlier, I was thinking about the fact that, again, a lot of the banking, finance is all online. So if you're in a situation where you're not in control of your phone, then it means you're not only losing control of your phone, but also of your finances. And that's a much bigger thing that, again, I can't use my phone to go on Instagram. It's so much more than that. It's such a bigger impact than just, you can't use your phone to call your friend. I mean, not that anyone makes phone calls anymore, but
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, and it's amazing to hear about all of these examples, and I think, incredible what Oxfam is doing. So I will definitely be following along with all of those if you can keep us updated with some of that. But I just wanted to switch gears ever so slightly now to talk about some other work that you are doing, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So you are acting as an AI working group co-lead as of October for NetHope. And so I saw your LinkedIn post about it, and it sounds absolutely fascinating, and got down a bit of a rabbit hole around it. But for the sake of people who haven't been stalking you on LinkedIn, can you talk a bit about both NetHope and what that kind of does, and also what this particular working group is trying to achieve?
Definitely. So NetHope is a membership-based organization that brings together nonprofit organizations by membership and industry partners. So, like private technology companies, for example, for the overall purpose of driving forward, digital transformation, digital maturity, leveraging that collective knowledge sharing and sometimes action for the benefit of all. So it's very much intended for supporting NGOs like humanitarian, development, and conservation organizations all progress so that we don't have these massive gaps and divides. And obviously everyone has like various levels of funding, various levels of access and resources and capacity. And one of this is just an ever-present challenge in the NGO space. And it's especially challenging in the technology NGO space, like technology within NGO space, because hiring people with expertise when you're competing with, private sector salaries is incredibly difficult. So that's what NetHope does. Well, I hope I've represented it well. Anyway.
Sounds good.
So Oxfam is a member within NetHope, and NetHope has a number of working groups that are both, they're co-led by NetHope staff as well as some NetHope members. So I'm a member co-lead of that group as of October. So we've actually just devised this structure. The working group has been around for several years actually, and they've produced some really great thinking, and they essentially it's a once a month meeting where you'll often have like a guest speaker, whether that's from the community or from industry or elsewhere, talking about like a service relating to AI or some learning that they've done, anything that a guest speaker you think would present on, and then and more recently we've actually set up this structure within the working group where we'll have 3 tracks, because AI is huge. It's really not just one thing, but we're sort of talking mostly, like generative AI, not sort of AI from 6 years ago. And we're looking at ethics and governance from one side. We're looking at AI in programs as a programmatic use or programmatic operations with AI, and then we haven't finalized like the names of these subgroups,
sure.
but the sort of internal operations, like the back office use of AI. And so I'm leading the ethics and governance track. So looking at developing a governance framework for, like a template governance framework for NGOs to be able to use and adapt to their own needs. So that could include policy or template policy, agreement on definitions, guidance, some red lines, potentially even some messaging frameworks if that's needed, and then of course hopefully training. I think some of that will be funding dependent, to be totally honest. Like training especially tends to be funding intensive.
Of course.
But then central to that, which is I think what my LinkedIn post might have been about, which I'm really excited about, is this humanitarian AI code of conduct, which I kicked off back in October at the NetHope Global Summit with a workshop with about 30 people or so, and we basically just took a bunch of sticky notes, like threw them on the walls with principles or ethical themes or ideas or challenges to come up with a skeleton framework of like what is something that we could agree to, like a code of conduct or a list of principles, whatever you really want to call it, that we can agree to as a sector before we really integrate AI across our programming or across our operations, because we are at this really critical point in the development of AI where like AI, the risks, the ethics, those are well documented and well known for the most part. But it also hasn't become ubiquitous yet. So this was, so unlike other emerging technologies like biometrics, for example, where that was introduced 20 years ago, it is now they're now used everywhere, but they come with really high risks and potential for harm. And it's really difficult to kind of backtrack once that sort of thing is now everywhere and agree like this is what our red lines are. This is what we agree counts as biometrics, whatever the case is. And so taking the learning from that and applying it to AI, where we do actually have the time to agree to definitions, to rules and regulations, to even just like the ethical principles that we want to take forward. And so that's the first step with this subgroup, is looking at actually putting together a common framework, a short, we're not looking at doing a research report into this. It's really meant to be 10 to 12 principles that is then the foundation of any sort of governance that comes out of that and will feed into it. So, we're talking pretty broad principles like making sure that platforms we use are transparent, that there's elements of traceability, explainability, things like that. But then also looking at the context-specific elements of AI for humanitarians. So like, what do we do with content generation that involves program participants or their data? That's a really specific problem for the humanitarian sector that I think, that there's broad agreement that we need agreement before, so that we can apply for funding on this sort of same foundation, or we can apply programs in the same foundation.
Yeah, I mean, that is a code of conduct for that is going to be, I think when you were sort of talking about it, I was like, oh my God, that's going to be so big. But I think the idea of doing the principles, but just because AI is such a big thing, like you say, it's not, when people talk about AI, it's not one thing, right? It spans so much. And I think so. But the idea of principles sounds very exciting. I think probably very challenging as well to kind of get that down to that many. I can imagine the sticky notes were vast and many. And making sure they're kind of covering the challenges and stuff. But it sounds absolutely fascinating, and it's exciting to think that could be something that's going to be used as like a foundation for years and hundreds of decisions that are going to get made and law, I'm guessing, at some point, because we're kind of at that point, right, the early cusp where it's a bit of a Wild West in terms of how people are using it right now, which is terrifying. But So,
I mean, I think the key for us is like, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. That was definitely for me. I'm not trying to like, I don't even think this is necessarily innovative, to be honest. I think this is just, we have an opportunity, we should take it. I don't think it should take very long. I could be wrong. It could take forever because, you know, anything collective action tends to take forever. But I think, you know, we can definitely refer to existing frameworks. There's plenty out there, and I think they're all decent and good. And so what this is trying to do is really draw from those, refer back to them, and have something that is, you know, that would be relevant for at least, you know, the middle term future, but that can be adaptable because of course this is going to change as we learn and grow. But I think just agreeing to those values and principles before we get started is really important, that we can refer back to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you say, it's going to change and evolve, right? And there's going to be problems and challenges that are going to come up that we can't even fathom at the moment because we can't predict necessarily how it's going to get used, and how people are going to abuse it, unfortunately, because that is that's how it goes, isn't it? I mean, I think AI like is like all technology, right? Like it always comes with its issues. Like there's always kind of the ethics and everything around it. And unintentionally creating new problems, kind of like the systems thinking stuff of like, oh, this is a great solution. Then you're like, oh my God, we never intended it to be used like this, like Christ.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of the principles, so the principles will be the kind of starting point, and then the idea from that is to go into more like in-depth governance,
tangible,
or what's the kind of next step?
Yeah, practical governance is definitely the next step. I think I love theory and philosophy as much as the next person, but I really try to have something like, this is your packet, you can use it now. And so, you know, that's why I say I don't want to linger too long on establishing a principles framework, although it is very important because there's so much that already exists and there's already so much broad agreement. You know, I think that being able to then produce, like, here is a policy that's been developed by, you know, however many member organizations that have experience in humanitarian development and conservation across the world. Like that, I think that's really meaningful to be able to produce a policy. And actually, some of these already exist. Like Oxfam has a policy on AI use internally. A couple other organizations have already submitted theirs. So that we've already been doing the sharing, but just creating a unified template is really useful. And then again, from that you can go into, well, here's some guidance, here's practical guidance, here's actually how you put policy into practice, which is always the hardest bit, is actually implementing policy. Policy's great, but if you can't implement it, it's worthless. So, so going from A to B and then beyond, you know, actually having this is recognizing this is going to be part of people's everyday lives. It's going to be a key part of many people's jobs, in good ways, you know, in many good ways, like helping to analyze or deduce from like massive amounts of reports, whatever the case is. But being able to, you know, apply, again, like the ethical principles framework with the policy, with the actual approach, and the guidance and training to go along with it. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, we talk about it quite a bit, but the tech is agnostic, right? It's how you use it. So there's so much potential for the good, obviously, and there is a lot of potential for the bad. I think there's quite a lot of you can very easily get into a rabbit hole of like how the robot overlords are gonna take over the world and ruin everything. Because we're talking a lot about it internally at the moment. Because obviously, you know, it's not a new thing, but it's kind of something that if you work in the sort of technical industry, it's been around for a while, but kind of is becoming so much more mainstream, for want of a better phrase that doesn't make me sound like a complete idiot. Looking for a polite word there. But, you know, now it's becoming much more kind of ubiquitous and all the rest of it. And, you know, we've got clients coming to us and saying, okay, so how are we, this new AI thing, how are we going to, how do we get that in our product? And, you know, and there is a bit of like, okay, let's not just sort of crowbar it in just for the sake of it, but not only on the product side. So I think similar to the pillars that you were talking about earlier, the ethics, how you're using it in programs, and then internal operations, we're having those conversations as a business because we're kind of talking about, okay, there are tools that we can, you know, there's features that we can put into products for the NGOs that we work with, and that could be great, that could be really interesting. How could we work with them on that? But then also internally, how we're using it, tools that we're using that's like, oh, if I use this, then that's going to save me hours every week, kind of looking into reporting and stuff. And it kind of on that small scale feels like, oh, great. But then it is, as soon as you peel back like a slight layer, like, oh, but where's this data going? And what are the biases that are coming into when I'm, getting chat to sort of generate some interview questions for me or come up with a job advert or whatever, or, ways of working kind of in proposals, things like that. And you're kind of like, oh, but where's this come from? How has this been generated? What's the kind of, where's it been, what's been feeding this? It's absolutely fascinating. And that's on our kind of, we are a small business and kind of looking at it from that perspective. So looking at it as an entire third sector perspective sounds very daunting, but absolutely fascinating. So I imagine.
And not to overcomplicate it, but to add like supply chain, chain issues with how AI is developed and how content is tagged and moderated, which is definitely within the news and affects communities that we work with, and and then also the climate impact of like just typing something into ChatGPT. I mean, these are the things. I think it's interesting you say technology is agnostic, and I don't know if I agree that it is, because I do think that at the end, at the core of any technology that's developed is the person who develops it. So we're not at that point where AI can think for itself yet, and from what I understand, we're aeons away. But I don't know, maybe I'm underestimating that, but there is absolutely a human element at the origin of AI technology or any technology, and subsequently that's going to reflect any of the biases, good, bad, neutral, of the person or people who are developing that technology. And so how it's deployed then is going to be reflective of that. And so anyway, I mean, I could go on and on about that.
No, please. No, please. It's actually really interesting. Like, as soon as you say that, I'm like, yeah, actually, because this is probably the first bit of tech, God, but it is a thing where it is, because of the machine learning and the input and all the rest of it, it's going to get away from that thing of like, well, it's just how you use it, because it is, like you say, it's being built, it's influenced by whoever's kind of feeding it. It's that I'm trying to think of a nicer way to say, like, terrible things in, terrible things out. Like there's a phrase.
Garbage in, garbage out.
yeah, there you go. Garbage in, garbage out. We use a slightly more British and swearier version of that when we're talking about it internally, which I won't repeat. But yeah, I mean, it does mean all of that bias is kind of going into it. So yes, oh my God, maybe we need to reconsider that principle about tech being agnostic, because it is absolutely. Like I said, you peel back that kind of one layer, and it is, and yeah, like supply chains. Oh my God, like all of that stuff is just. That is, it's a lot.
Like any business, like any business we engage in, it's something that we would want to. We as in, Oxfam, we as in the sector, or consumers, just wanting to understand what is actually going into the development of something that we're going to be using. And I think, also thinking again about like we are working in very specific, broad but specific contexts, like humanitarian and development contexts, and one of the challenges that I often have is that the technologies that we have to use because there's no other options available are not developed for these contexts. And so what does that mean? So you do still have like the origin of the technology and the biases that it might be reproducing, or the lack of transparency, the lack of fairness, whatever the case is. But then it's also just the purpose that it's being used for. Is it fit for purpose, and how do we feed that perspective back towards those who are developing the technology, or how do we enable and support other businesses or other developers who are developing that technology that specifically come from those contexts? Like there's loads of businesses and firms popping up across like Africa, for instance, on AI technology, and there's one in particular that I think is really interesting. The name is skipping my mind at the moment. That's looking at languages and language translation, and we're sort of I've seen a lot about how like one of the really great uses of AI is translation, but the reality of it actually being able to translate local languages, or we're talking like languages to English, not languages to other languages, or so anyway, I mean. again, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rabbit hole. But just looking at like, actually, what is that data? How accurate is it? And how do we kind of ensure that we're taking a global approach, we're taking an inclusive approach, rather than just relying on these technologies that are being developed in the global north to then disperse amongst global south.
Yeah, definitely. And I think making sure as well that we're not kind of the technology, I think, can be a bit more dismissive of like the outliers and stuff, and be like, oh, that doesn't quite match the pattern or whatever, so we're just gonna ignore that. And that's kind of that feels like that is a dangerous space from an ethical perspective, to just to leave out entire sector, those kind of intersections that we're talking about, to be like, well, that doesn't fit the pattern, so we'll just ignore that and say that this is correct. Things like people putting questions into GPT and you're like, oh my god, the answers that you're getting are, who knows where it has got that information from, and why is it doing that. I had a really great conversation with someone from Greenpeace, so he was the head of data, and he was talking about the fact that when you're looking at any kind of data, the thing you have to consider is like, what do they want you to think off the back of this data? So what are they trying to get across? What's their why? And I think because it's kind of with AI where it's like, well, it's the computers, they don't have a motive, and then even like I was saying earlier, like it's agnostic, and it's like, but it's not when it comes down to what's being fed into the machine. There is not necessarily an agenda there, because it's not doesn't have to be that dramatic, but in some cases there will be that bias I think is going to exist.
Yeah, even just a reflection of, if we're trying to build this technology to reflect how humans think, well, then we have to be honest about how humans think. Yeah. And that includes all of the flaws as well. And so I think just even reflecting or reproducing our own biases, and there isn't necessarily a value judgment attached to that either. It's just being able to objectively look at that and see how it could introduce issues or inequalities, or make those inequalities worse, essentially. But I think also I do take I think a pretty optimistic view, or at least a hopeful view of this. I think I want to be able to for us, within the sector, to be able to be taking these stories and these experiences that we have within the sector, either by like raising platforms of communities themselves and their voices themselves, which is definitely the preferred way, or otherwise by having these experiences and reflecting that back to whomever is developing that technology, so that it's integrating a more holistic perspective. Because I do think it benefits everybody. It doesn't. It's not just about saying, hey, you're excluding all of these people and you're exposing your own bias. This is how you can. This is how the technology can actually better reflect the whole world, and not just sort of our own limited perspective of the world from any one spot on the globe.
Nice. So it's good. So you have an overall positive view on the direction of travel, if you like, for AI.
Yeah, I mean, until the robots come, yeah.
Well, yeah, sure. And obviously they're listening right now. So yeah, we love the robots, right? No, it's good to know. It's it's definitely it's so interesting talking to people that are involved in it. And like I said, I will continue to stalk you on LinkedIn to keep up with this code of conduct, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. It'll be so interesting to see, presumably, hopefully be published as some kind of, these principles that are kind of public. It'd be so interesting to see them, just to understand what's kind of being identified by the sector as the current risks and the challenges, and kind of the principles that we want to kind of abide to. Because obviously for us working with NGOs and building technology and trying to sort of involve AI, we are kind of looking, we can look internally, but obviously very aware of our own biases, and we're kind of looking for that collective steer of like, okay, what are the principles that we want to kind of abide by. So I will definitely be checking back in on that. But it's good to know that there is some optimism there, because I think it can get a bit negative otherwise. So that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. That's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think I've said the word interesting and amazing about 20 million times, so I'll go and find a thesaurus and try and swallow it. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.